All right, guys, welcome to ITS 450, Software Assurance. Okay, so today we are, what are we doing today? The Buffer Overflow 2 practical exam. Is that what we're doing today?
Professor, we're having it next week, right?
Next week, okay. So, all right. So definitely then you guys know that we have this next week, okay? We're gonna do that. That's gonna be the practical exam for buffer overflow, which I talked about last week, okay? So next Thursday then we will do that. Remember, that's just going to be one problem. So we're, it'll be like Thursday, it'll start at 6. Usually what I do with this one is we're gonna do from 6 to 8, 6 to 8, but then I might, yeah, so either 6 to 8 or 6 to 9. I'll think about that. I might just give you 3 hours instead of 2. It's really just one problem though. It's just one problem. Usually, I'll have to think about it. I think you just need 2 hours really. So it might just actually be from 6 to 8. So what's going to happen is I'm, just kind of like the exam, I'm going to explain a few things, give you some information. As you can see, I haven't posted the problem yet because I'm going to post it that day, like at 6. And you just have to solve it, right? You have to I can tell you, you're going to, it's some kind of getting a shell or getting something to happen. Maybe I could even, instead of a shell, I could change it to, I just want you to print a message, but it's the same idea, right? It's going to involve the 3 things: set UID, format string, and buffer overflow. And that will be the conclusion of the sequence of C and C++. Now, I'm done with that material. As you remember, now we are switching over to web security. So this is a software assurance class. And obviously we have to study the classic examples of software assurance in C++ because that is very pertinent to, exploits and vulnerabilities and pen testing and all of that, right? You're all familiar with that. And so now hopefully you understand how it is that people get these root shells, reverse shells, whatever. And so that's we're done covering that. And now we're going to switch over to the other medium, which is really, everything nowadays happens on the internet, right? Everything is the internet, basically web apps, web apps, involving all the technologies, Ajax, jQuery, JavaScript, CSS, HTML, SQL databases, the terminal, the servers, everything together, right? And so that's really, a lot of you will probably work, or some of you will work in web development. And for those of you that work in web development, it's the same thing. It's not just about, kind of getting the program to work. You have to be aware, you have to be convinced that input validations need to be in place. You need to work on things. And I know, for instance, this is not a SQL class, and I know you've taken a lot of SQL classes where you cover things like stored procedures and all of that. And so, basically I'm going to assume you know that. So we're not really going to address it too much, except just like with everything else, PHP, etc. I'm just going to assume you know it. But we are going to just look at the specific problems and controls that are in place for that. So I haven't loaded the modules yet for this. Usually I have my modules, but because of this bright space, I've been rethinking the courses as I go along the semester, and because of online, I'm also rethinking things. So I haven't posted the modules, but I'm pretty sure today I'm just going to get into the project again. Remember, you form your groups of 3, I believe we said. Start working on that project, okay? How many of you have already started working on the project? Okay, not many. You need to start working on that project. I can't stress enough how much work that is. The project is worth 30% of your grade, and that grade is really it reflects how much work it is. Right, so it's a lot of work, a lot of everything that you've learned from cryptography to sysadmin to all the classes, 362 and databases and so on. All right, so you have to build that. So it's an e-commerce site, remember. So today I will most likely, I will get into the project again, just kind of give you a little bit more background on it. And, because I'm not really covering anything related to C, C++ anymore, right? We're done with that. We just have the practical exam, but we're done with that as far as new material or content that I would provide for you related to that. And instead now, most of the lectures and labs are going to be based on or focused on web security, the internet, web applications. So certainly in that sense, you're more familiar with that medium. I'm not going to cover Java or anything like that, but I know there's a class in the program that you can take an elective that is pretty much software assurance in Java, I believe. So you can probably take that. All right.
Question.
Go ahead, please. Yes.
For exam 1, when will we have our grade?
So you had the exam on Tuesday, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you have to give me some time to grade it. I'll try to have something by next week. So if I can. So that would be the plan.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. All right, so it takes me a while to grade those, but hopefully by next week I will have them graded. Again, you can ask questions today if you're still, unsure of something with the lab. Definitely ask any questions although I wasn't planning on spending time on the 3 previous labs. Are there any questions about SetUID? I've graded a lot, and some of you resubmitted it and got it right the second time around, so I've graded those. Format strings, have I started grading format strings? I want to say that I have, and I've noticed that format strings is, everyone did a lot better in format strings. Now the buffer overflow lab, when was that due?
It's due tonight.
Oh, it's due tonight. Okay. All right. So you haven't submitted buffer overflow. Okay. All right. So are there any questions about buffer overflow then?
No, not for me.
No? Okay. All right. Well, all right. Yeah. So as I said, SetUID I know is confusing. Some of you got it the second time around. Format string, I think a lot of you got it because I looked at it. A lot of you were changing the letters, at least randomly. And most of you changed it to the first letter of your name. So that was good. And then I guess I'll take a look at the buffer overflow lab tonight, or when you're going to submit it tonight. I'll take a look at it sometime next week, probably. But if you have questions for the practical exam, you definitely need to ask them, right? Now, I will be there on the test to help you out. The practical exam, I provide a lot of help, but there's a few things that I want you to figure out, right? You might know that what I want you to figure out is the return address. I want you to understand the GDB and the memory, right? And if there's some particular code, and you're going to be doing a code injection of some type, okay? All right. So it seems there's no questions about the buffer overflow lab. Therefore, there's no questions. So I'm not hearing any.
So for the project, which files are we following?
Say that again.
For the project, what files are we following?
What files are you following for the term project?
Yeah, because there's like a ton of files in there. I'm kind of confused on what we're.
Yeah, I can go over these again, but as I said, this is a complex project, right? So there's a lot of files in there. So let me go over that again. So project files. You're seeing my bright space, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I got an email from somebody here. If you can remind me what your question was about set UID, that would be, I could give you an answer over this. But anyway, all right, so project files, you can see them here. So this is the code. Remember that you're developing an e-commerce site. You're not developing, right? So remember the scenario is a company had an employee who was pretty good, was developing a website, and that person quit. You got a better job. They hired you to finish the job. Now, everything is done really well. You just have to finish up the work, and in particular, so you have to read a lot of code, and you have to kind of provide software assurance, right? Make sure it meets both quality and security. So remember both things. So all the code files are here. And remember, they're written in MVC, which we talked about. These are going to be PHP, HTML, and CSS files. You're going to find them there. Plus, the information for the MySQL database will be in there, the script that you have to run. So I provided this document, which provides kind of an overview of how you would set everything up. Okay? Read it carefully. You know, this is a setup on a VM, so you have to kind of set up the VM. As you know, you're going to have everything in var ww in there and HTML, and then you're going to set up a folder. Don't start moving the folders around or changing the files because you're going to start breaking the links, right? Everything is made so that you just put it there, and then I guess that the main document that you would follow first is this one to answer your question. These two files are really where you start. Now in 362, you should have done something similar to this, a configuration. And so that's the basic idea, okay? So start there. Now, when you get to the part about the email, you can read this for additional information, but that's something that you don't have to get to. These two IEEE documents are for documentation only. So when you start writing your report, okay, so you don't have to do that now. This is just a description of the project. Read through that. Questions, this is something that you don't have to do immediately, but eventually at the end, you have to make sure you've answered all of these questions. This document, the SRS, is basically the template that you should use for your report. The peer evaluation is what you fill out at the end of the semester. And then 450 PDF, this is, this is the template of the testing. So what that means is, we haven't covered that topic yet, but at the end of, not at the end, I should say, about 60% of the work should be code related, 40% should be testing. What that means is you're gonna check inputs, you're gonna basically test the code to see that it doesn't break. And so that document is kind of the format that I want you to follow. But to answer your question, start with these two files. Make sense?
Yep.
Okay, great. Start there. So, download the code on your VM and then follow this is not a tutorial, but it provides some guidance on how to set everything up. So remember so I'm answering someone's question about set UID. Remember, the logic is you have a text file that is root owned, right? A secret. Only root can open it with cat. Seed comes in, tries to open it with cat, they can't. So then what do? You create a C program. The C program has a system call. What system call? The same one that Seed would type on the terminal. Cat, the secret file. Then what you do is you take that C program, compile it, make it root owned. So that means that the owner of that program is root, and make it set UID. Now, Seed, not saying, not typing like sudo or anything. It's got to be like Seed regular user will go in and run that program that has the system call cat secret file that is root owned and set UID, but Seed runs it. And remember, we've talked about this several times. Seed, when Seed runs the program, it'll gain the privileges of root. The effective ID will become the effective ID of root. So when Seed runs that program, the program runs cat, the secret file. If you're using CSH, so if you've changed the link of SH from bash to CSH, CSH, as we discussed, has a vulnerability. And so what ends up happening is that Seed runs the program and is able to read the file because Seed retains the root privileges when using CSH. And that's it. Okay, so does that answer your question? I mean, so the people that are emailing me about that, just reply back and let me know if that answers your question. Basically, from what I read in your question, I see an error in what you're saying, but just let me know if you still have questions about that. All right. So, are there any other questions about labs? Any other questions about labs?
Not right now.
Not right now. All right. All right. Well, make sure you submit that buffer overflow lab tonight. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive into the project today, give you more background on it. Next week on Tuesday, I'm going to introduce the top, more of like the lab on we're going to start a new lab, which is called the Same Origin Policy Lab. You will see it's a very easy lab to do, but I gotta start there. It has to do with the security and how browsers are designed to provide security for you. So everything, so I should say all web security starts with your browser, right? So, that's why browsers have such a, domain. That's why everybody has a browser, right? So Mozilla has a browser, Microsoft has a browser, Google has a browser, because it all starts there as far as the web. Without a secure browser, you can't really do a lot of things. All right, so so that's the plan next week. Today, as I said, what I want to do is I'm just going to go over an introduction of web security and the project itself, kind of give you a little bit more background on it. And then you guys, I do strongly recommend that you start working on your project with your teams at some point. Maybe in about 2 weeks, what I would suggest is that in one of the labs, we make it like a demo session. And what you do is you're going to show me where you are. So what I would say is I'm going to give you this goal or objective, however you want to call it, that in 2 weeks, you need to have the code that I provided. So the code that I provided here, this one, you should have that running on your VM. So you should be able to show me, you know, open a browser and then you type some URLs and you show me the e-commerce site that you already, not that it's finished or that it's, but certainly the way that you have it there, you'll be able to run whatever is done there and you'll get a website. And so that, what I would recommend to keep everyone on track is that you should try to do that. Or that should be your goal. In 2 weeks, to have the website loaded up. When we do the SQL injection lab, that will also provide a little bit more information. As I said, all of these labs tie into the project really nicely. All right, so that being said, then, if I don't see any questions from anyone for the SetUID lab, so I assume I answered their questions. So let me switch over to the whiteboard here. All right. Okay. So what I'm going to talk about now today is the term project. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the project. All right, so the project, as you know, is an e-commerce site. It's an e-commerce site. It is written in MVC model, and that's one of the things I'll talk about today a little bit. It uses PHP quite extensively, MySQL, MySQL, and then, you know, the CSS, JavaScript, and jQuery, which is, you know, one possible problem. jQuery. Right? It does not have Ajax, and everything is encrypted. So HTTPS. But right now, not all pages are encrypted, so you're going to have to deal with that. And you'll be doing this on your VM. I would suggest, you know, either 1604 or 1804. Stick with those that, you know, have been around a little bit longer. Okay. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is structure and design of this website. All right, so we're going to talk about structure and design. Okay. And as I've said a couple of times, we're going to talk about MVC, which stands for the Model View Controller. Model View Controller. All right, so what that means is that the code is broken up into discernible parts, right? So, you know, instead of having one gigantic file for every page, you actually have the files broken up into pieces. So you have the lot, you know, you have model, you have view, and you have the controller. And that really pretty much relates to the, you know, the files or the data. So here is the data. Right? That's going to be your data. Then the view is the presentation, what you see, right? And then the controller is the logic. Okay, so what ties everything together and reacts to user activity. So in a sense, this is SQL, right? SQL related, database related. this is going to be related to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And logic will be PHP, basically. So, you know, kind of the thing that brings everything together, the programs and all the files together. So controller, it would be the PHP code. And you know all the code basically. It's, you know, the database here. Okay, so that's really the idea. So when it's said that this is, you know, the databases, so anything related to the stored procedures, everything like that, even the objects that make the calls to the database in PHP would be, you know, the model. And the goal of this is really, and it makes a lot of sense, that you know, if you have PHP, if you have controller files, then you really want to have a lot of PHP there and very little of anything else, right? And then where you have the HTML is the same. So if it's something related to presentation, you know, you don't want to have, this is the controller, you don't want to have PHP there. You kind of want to have everything in the HTML. Right, and the same thing with the database. You know, you don't even have the queries. You try to limit having a lot of SQL and PHP. Instead, you have the stored procedures, and you just call them. Okay, so that's really the idea with that. So you don't want to intermingle the different components, and that just makes for cleaner code, more organized code that's easier to read. And that will help you with, you know, your software assurance for quality and security. So let's talk a little bit about web security then. So right now you've had already some, you know, 6 weeks of software assurance, and you understand, okay, you know, basically looking at the code as it relates to C. Now we have the same ideas, the exact same ideas. The only thing that's going to change is that the languages are different, right? And so the behavior will be a little bit different, but it's still the same things, right? You're still going to try to do input validations. You're still going to try to inject code in some way, and we're just going to look at those examples. So there's kind of a relationship between, in web security, there's kind of a relationship with, let's say, performance, usability, right, versus security, time spent on the project, and of course the cost of it. Right, so there's kind of this relationship, which you might imagine. So on this end, you know, we have more or less, right? So the more security you have, the better, you know, but the more time that's going to take. Obviously, the amount of money is going to go up, especially if you have to do, you know, you have to, as you will see, you have to do a lot of testing in your project. And so you have to do a lot of testing. That means you have to hire people to do that testing, and that's going to cost money. So, you know, adding that security means adding more cost to the project and more time. On the other end, the performance, of course, you know, just the example of SSL, right? So if we encrypt, although it seems minor, if you have to do a lot of this all the time, you know, you're affecting performance of your computing devices, and the usability might, you know, the fact that you have to log in now, right, makes it more work, etc. So there's certainly a relationship between all of these. So for instance, you know, as I said, SSL would put a strain on the server. But nowadays, the standard approach is everyone pretty much encrypts everything. And so it used to be that you would only, you know, you'd have a web e-commerce site and a lot of it is not encrypted, but then the checkout process would be encrypted. But that now, you will probably just encrypt everything. So you're going to have to change your files to meet that requirement. Okay. Additionally, in web security, there's the, well, you know, it's web. That means it's running on a server. So that means you also have to do the server admin, which you will have to do. In this case, we are using Ubuntu, right? And you'll have to use Apache. Okay. And so, but there's other things that you can think of, like firewalls, antivirus, disabling unnecessary software, patching, not using default variables. One of the things that you will do when you know, the question that John had initially about following that guide, you know, one of the questions there is set up a lot of things and you're going to have to put in passwords, right? And so the question that you want to answer for yourself is, what passwords do I use? Because in theory, if you were doing this for real, you'd have to use secure passwords. Now, the advantage nowadays is that pretty much everyone uses the cloud. And so the cloud provides a lot of the sysadmin for you, right? So Zoom and all these companies, even, they don't really have their own data centers. They just rent devices from AWS, Google, etc., GoDaddy. So you have to really think about those issues. Then, of course, there's the database, all right? So what information are you going to store in the database? Okay, so you're going to create, remember that one of the things you have to do in this project is you have to create accounts. Okay, so you have to create accounts, and that means that you're going to be storing the information of users in the database. However, you know, there's several approaches out there that people have. One is, you maybe in the past you thought if you process credit cards that you must absolutely store the credit cards. And in fact, it turns out that you don't. So if you feel that as a business, storing the credit cards of users would be too much of a risk for you, you can actually build an e-commerce site without storing the credit cards on your own database. And that you can store your own accounting system and you can have your own information. You just don't store the credit card. So it's really a choice that you can make. So the approach to that is you use what is called a credit card clearinghouse. Okay. And in particular for this project, we're going to use one called authorize.net. So use what is called a payment gateway. All right. And in this project, we can use authorize.net. So really, all you're doing with regards to credit cards is you're going to collect it in your website, right? You're going to collect the credit cards in your website, but then you're going to just establish a secure connection, an encrypted tunnel or connection between your website and authorize.net. So you do have to securely transfer the credit card information to them, but you don't actually store them. Instead, they're going to store them in their own databases, and they're going to have kind of a record of the transaction, and then you just reconcile it with your own records. So that's one of the approaches. Okay. And then, of course, the code itself, right? We will see, you know, as we start talking about all the different things, we'll look at, you know, issues with Java, with PHP, with SQL, and with other things that we must address. So that will be basically when it comes to the security of the code itself, the labs will help us to address some of those issues. Remember also, I want to say that this class is one of the classes that aligns the best with the book. So your book, the Wenliang Du book, what is it? Computer and Information Security, or Computer and Internet Security. Really aligns really well with all the labs. There's basically one chapter in that book for every single lab we're doing this semester. And then I showed you the book for the project also that you can read. All right, so nowadays, as I said, you would probably, if you don't use your own server that you house in your own site, you're gonna have to get a server from like Amazon, AWS, GoDaddy, Google, I believe now is doing hosting. IBM also is getting into that, and Oracle. All right, so now, as you know, one thing about the server and in Apache is that your files are going to be located in var, ww, html, right? And these are the only files that are going to be accessible from the browser. However, in the files, this is the file system, as you know. In the file system, you can have other files that your website could potentially access. Now, usually what is recommended is that you create, usually when you do these kind of things in a sandbox, they also provide a folder called, scripts, let's call it, scripts. And there you can have several scripts that you can run sometimes, but running scripts, just be aware, like running a Python script or a Perl script is a dangerous thing, okay, for obvious reasons, because it's things that are running in the terminal itself. So Apache uses a directive in the web server to limit the web server to working only with files found within, this directory. Okay, so you won't, that's a security mechanism that you should not try to change. Now, if you want, one of the things you probably will want to check as you do PHP is you want to look at the current settings. So if you want the current settings, of PHP, you can, in a PHP file, just type the function php info. Okay, so you just type that in your file, and that will give you all the parameters that are there. So if you want to, you don't really have to change much, but that's where you can look at the parameters that are set. Sometimes you want to see if a library is installed or what's the default value for something. Now, if you want to make changes in PHP, there should be a file called the php.ini file. So this is the file where you can make changes. Make changes. Okay. All right, so those are just some of the basic things of PHP. All right, now that we've talked a little bit about that, let's talk about a couple of processes in a couple of things related to the e-commerce site. As I said to you, several parts of the website are broken. Okay, as you start working through through implementing it, you will notice that a lot of things or some things are broken, intentionally so, right? They're broken so that you have to find them in a way and try to fix them. Okay, so there's there's one main process that's going to give you trouble because it'll break several times. And I think I mentioned this before, and that's the checkout. So checking out. So the checkout process is going to give you the most trouble because it's the one of the things that you really have to debug carefully. One of the things you have to debug carefully. Right, so what happens is you get to a page and then the encryption breaks. So then when you fix the encryption, okay, you're gonna do this and then the database connection breaks. And then you fix that, but then, okay, the validation breaks. And then when you do that, okay, now the credit card transmission to authorized.net breaks and so on. And then the email breaks. And so what I would recommend is as you start to debug that, you know, and you start to try to fix things as you're doing your code audit, there are some things that you can just disable right away. So for instance, the email, you don't really need the email for everything to work. So just turn it off and keep going with the process, right? But nothing will work if you don't fix the encryption first, right? So you have to get the HTTPS done and taken care of. So definitely the checkout process will be what will give you a lot of trouble in the beginning, and that's where you must focus your attention. So there are 4 parts. I'm going to give you a little bit of hints here. There are 4 parts to the checkout process. Okay, they are: 1, you take and validate the shipping information. Shipping information. Right? Then you take and validate the billing information. Billing information. Then you're going to process the payment, which is, you know, dealing with authorized.net. So process payment, and that's authorized. You have to test this really well, all right? So a lot of this project is not that you got it to work once. It's really that you have to, as I said, it's most of the code is done. I would say that roughly 80% of the code is done or more. And most of it is correct. It's just these little errors, right? So some errors I've left in there kind of hidden in there. And so the point is that you've thoroughly read everything, you've thoroughly tested everything, and the solutions are not complex, but they do require you to check everything really well. Remember that when you're debugging in PHP, it's good to use, for instance, the echo, right? So you echo, you know, line 2, and then down over here, you echo at line 13. So if you get that echo, but you don't get this echo, you figure out that your error has happened somewhere between line 2 and line 13, okay? So just remember that. That's a good practice when you're debugging the code line by line. So at least it's sequential, you'll find the error that way. And then wrap it up as the 4th part of the checkout. Wrap it up All right, and that just means email, send the email. What is the email? You know, when you guys go on Amazon and you buy something, you're waiting for that email to arrive, right? That email tells you, okay, I completed the transaction. And so you definitely want then to get that email. Okay. You also then have a receipt, which the receipt is really just a page. And that one, actually, I think it's done. Right, that one is done, but you have to get through everything else. So once you see the receipt, I believe at that point you're done, because it's the last part of the checkout process. But just again, I want to stress, this is the part that's going to give you the most trouble. And for you to even get checkout to work, you have to make sure that you've done HTTPS first, right? This is where I would think using 1604 is better, but because you're gonna find a lot better tutorials on how to set up HTTPS in 1604. You don't want to just like go experiment with the latest version of Ubuntu, which is going to have a lot less support, okay, a lot less configuration, or a lot more problems, basically. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this one. So to communicate with authorized.net, you're basically going to do that from PHP. So authorized.net is literally a website somewhere. You're going to have to create an account. You're going to have to write some lines of code in your PHP that get you to authorized.net. So there are 3 files, I believe, in the code, 3 PHP files that handle the communication with authorized.net. You will have to address those. Most of the basic code is there, but you're going to receive from authorized.net some tokens and like a username, passwords, and some instructions on how to make that authentication process. Basically, a PHP post, so a post request, remember, and I'll talk a little bit about post and get, but a post request is going to be made. So a post request will be made from your PHP code over SSL. So over SSL, right, needs to be made. You'll probably need to install a library called libcurl, right, which is the library that will support your communication with authorized.net, okay? That's basically the CURL library, curl. Okay, so you're going to have to use that library to make the communication, but it's not terribly complicated. It's very straightforward. Okay. So what is curl? Let's talk a little bit about that. And all of this, by the way, is in that book that I recommended, the e-commerce book site, the e-commerce book. So you can definitely find all that information there as well. All right, so CURL or curl is basically a command line utility. It's a command line utility, right, for performing network communications. For network communications. And you can use this from your PHP website. And so you will be integrating curl's libcurl library. You're going to integrate that into PHP. You might find the information on whether that's supported by your server by calling the function php info, whether it's configured and everything like that. Now, as far as creating the developer accounts on authorize.net, you will have to go to authorize.net. And on there, you're going to create an account. So that's one thing you can start doing as soon as possible. Create an account, right? And you're going to be able to set up a developer account and a dummy, not dummy, but like a test account that you can use to try out the transactions, everything, but it's not going to be tied to a bank account. Eventually, once you went live with, you were using authorize.net, you would basically tie that to a bank account, and then now any transactions that you make, any sales from clients via credit card would get recorded, and posted to your account. Obviously, authorize.net would probably charge some kind of a fee for that. Okay. So how do you then start with your project now? Now this assumes, remember, I'm asking you guys in about 2 weeks to have your e-commerce site running on your VM. Once you do that, you're going to have to start looking into the HTTPS, right? You have to look into configuring that. And then make sure one thing that students get wrong sometimes with this project is the directory structure, right? They start moving files around, don't do that, or they don't put the file in the right place. Also, the paths that you do in your config files are sometimes incorrect. So definitely don't change anything. Don't change the structure. Instead, maybe, and don't change the link in the pages. Instead, keep everything as is, so you don't overcomplicate this project. So where does the checkout process begin? So I've been talking about the checkout process, right? But where does it begin? So the checkout process begins in a file called checkout.php. So it literally, that's the first file that you would probably, once everything you think it's configured, obviously the checkout process requires encryption, given that at that point the user will start putting in their information, their credit card information. Very soon you're going to make a connection to authorize.net and so on. You're also sending data about the transactions to your own database, and so that's where everything would be encrypted. Now remember that in theory you can have your web data, your PHP files in one server, and then you can have a separate server for the database. But here, of course, you can do everything in your single VM. Now, one thing that's going to happen that you must check is the links, okay? The links of the web pages. If you're trying to connect via HTTPS, but the HTML files may have HTTP links, URLs, you're going to have to explore that and figure out the best approach, right, to make sure that you're always connecting via HTTPS. Maybe something like doing absolute URLs, for instance. Okay, you're gonna now the checkout page will call things like because of MVC, we'll call files like checkout.header.html. So this file is the one that might actually have any links of interest. So when you're searching for things, you know, this will have like include checkout header, include checkout footer, and so on. So you're going to have to trace back the files that way to figure out where the errors might be. Okay. So when you're in the checkout process, there, you know, the checkout process will call the transactions table. So checkout will call the transactions table. Right? And this table, the transactions table, will stores a record of every call to the payment gateway. So you will record all transactions in there. So you need to make sure that that works as well. One of the tests that you have to do is you have to make sure maybe the error that I put in there is an error that won't break, but it's incorrect logically. Okay, so you have to make sure that things are recorded appropriately. You know, I could be recording 0 for the value that a person purchases, right, instead of the actual quantity. So you would always get a number in there. It just wouldn't be reflect the right one. So testing involves all of this, making sure the transactions are completed. Then you have to go to fulfillment, remember, where you actually are an employee in inventory, and you're going to then ship the products to your client. Okay. So that's basically the idea of the checkout process. So I wanted to kind of, all I'm doing is I'm trying to highlight areas where I want you to focus first, right? So definitely telling you, I already told you where to start. Start at the checkout PHP file. That file will have all the includes of all the other files it needs, and you can follow the sequence from there. Are there any questions so far?
No.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. No questions? All right. Okay, so again, I'm just describing the e-commerce site. All right, so now we've talked about the checkout process, so you're aware of that one. The next thing I'm going to talk about is, as part of the checkout process, you have to process credit cards. So processing credit cards. Processing credit cards, right? So here, again, as I said, this uses libcurl. There are 3 files. So there are 3 files associated with this process. Okay, they are called gateway setup.php The other one is gateway setup admin .php. And the third one is gateway process.php. Okay, so these are the three files. You'll have to find them, and then you'll know, okay, these are the three files related to this. So the way it works is pretty straightforward. If we take a snapshot of, let's say, gateway setup, oops. Gateway underscore setup dot php. So if we take a look at that one, this is going to be the file that collects data to send in an array, basically. So you're going to, the way it works is you kind of create an array, and then you're going to send some data out there to authorize.net. So you will, if you're remembering, let's imagine you're in your PHP file. You got your little PHP script there, tags, and then now you're going to create an array. All this code is provided, so I'm not going to write it all, but I'm just giving you an idea. So array is there, right? Data, and then you start filling in the information. So you're going to get some information from, oops, it's an array, so something like X card, and you have to use the names of things that authorize.net recognizes. So X card number, right, like credit card number, and then you're gonna provide maybe your credit card number, right, and so on. You have several fields there. You're going to define the URL, and then authorize.net will give you a login. So it'll be something like X login, right? And whatever they give you, I don't know, it's like a number, sequence of numbers. And then also you're going to have a transaction key that they provide. All right, and because you're using encryption and everything, there's no problem of losing the information. So that's really how it works. It's pretty simple, really. This array also includes, if I continued over here, it will, dot, dot, dot. It includes things like, order total, right? So I think it's called X amount, transaction amount, and then it's going to be your whatever your variable order total. So a lot of this will be there, and just read through it, but it should be correct, I think. Really, this just needs, honestly, just the tokens that are provided from authorize.net. Now that you've done this, you basically just will perform something called URL encoding. Right, so let's say, you're going to have, a string, and let's just, you're going to call a function URL encode, take data, right? And that's what you're going to be sending. So at this point, you do the encoding, and now you're going to call this the curl request. You're going to do the curl request, and then basically you're going to make the communication. So all the steps there, curl, something like, I'm not going to write all of it again, but I'm just going to say, like, you create a variable request, which is curl init, right? And then you have some URL that you're using. URL that you're using. You might have some parameters in there, but finally, you're going to run a command using curl, that's called curl exec, like execute. And then what do you execute? You will execute that request. Right, so you're gonna execute the request. And basically the request should be tied to everything, to the string and so on, and you send that along to authorize.net. So that's basically the general idea of how the code works. As you can see, it's just really an array, fill in some parameters, link it, do the encoding, link it to the request. Here, somewhere in here, I had to link the string, this string, to the request. Okay, but as I said, all of that code is provided in the project already. You should, in theory, you should just have to check the parameters and plug in the authentication strings. Finally, once you make the connection to curl or to authorize.net and everything works out, you also need to save, let's just say finally, you need to save everything to your database except the credit card information, which that is only sent to authorize.net for them to process the payment, but you don't have to save it. And that's just going to be some kind of a stored procedure. So you're going to do something like call add transaction. And the stored procedures, all of them are created for you. So that's one good thing about this is you don't have to, as I said, I don't recommend actually that you modify the database in any way. You can add new tables if you'd like, but the stored procedures work. The database pretty much in good shape. And finally, once this is done and everything works out, if success of everything, you are redirect to final.php. If you get to this file, you know you've completed everything. But, I won't lie to you, it's not going to be super easy to get to that in the beginning, right? Because you have to, this is where a lot of the bugs are located in the code. And that's the point of this project, finding them and fixing them. So this is, the final page should be the receipt. So basically it does a few things, sends the email, and that's just the email that will confirm that you have done this correctly or that the transaction is complete, the email confirmation, and then also it displays a receipt in the web page itself. Now, let's look at final just to kind of give you an idea. Let's imagine you're in final.php. So final.php is where the email is called. So to do that, to call the email module, what's going to happen let's imagine this is the PHP file. Somewhere in there's going to be an include that is going to be something like includes, and then there's going to be email receipt. I believe that's the name. .php, right? So that's the file that would have to have all the code for this, the configuration of the email, how you're going to do it. How you do the email, it's not really how can I say this? It's up to you. I leave it to you guys to figure out how to do it. There are very simple ways of doing it, and there are more complicated ways of doing it. I really don't, it doesn't matter much as long as you send, you know, the email in some way. Initially, though, if you just want to see things without getting this part to work, you know, you can always just comment it out, right, and then just keep going. All right. Are there any questions about any of that?
No, not right now.
No questions? Okay. All right. So now then, now let's talk a little bit about some of the security of this. So a lot of these things, I'm right now just kind of listing the things that we will be doing. A lot of this will actually be addressed with the future labs, okay, that we will be exploring. So the labs, you know, there's WebSOP, which SOP stands for Same Origin Policy. So these are labs, all labs that we will do. Then after that, we're going to do the SQL injection lab. I think you'll really like that lab. It's really nicely done. SQL injection lab. Then after that, we're going to have CSS, cross-site script. Oh, actually, I should say CSS is the name of it, but it's actually spelled XSS because so it doesn't conflict with Cascade style sheets. And then there's going to be cross-site request forgery, CSRF, and so on. So these are the main, some of the main labs that we will be covering related to security of your websites. As you know, one important thing when you're dealing with sending data over PHP is that you have the post and the get array. Post and get, right? So you guys are familiar with those, and you know that usually get is like that URL, that little URL at the top, whereas post, you don't really see the information because it's sent kind of as an attached file in the transaction. So most of the website is done in post. However, in some of the labs, we will actually use both methods for various tasks. We'll, just to illustrate the differences in security issues of both methods. But, you know, those labs really, most of the lab, you really, you should do your PHP pages with post anyway. So, and that's reflected in the website itself. These are called the post and get arrays. As you know, a browser sends user input through either the get request or a post request. And the post request would be the preferred method. So if you didn't remember that, this is the preferred method. Which the post just means that the web server bundles up all the user input and puts it into an array named post. Right, and this is usually in the form. So you have a form, right, in HTML, and there's going to be something like type of action. You can say like type, and then it's going to be get or post. All right, other things that we will consider is SQL, with SQL databases. Remember that here, you know, you have the problem that sometimes you have inputs from the user, like in particular, like when they're putting their credit card information or they're putting their address or their name. Remember, they're going to be creating accounts, etc. So in that case, you know, they have the ability to write into that text boxes. So you have to do input validation. Now, a lot of the input validation is done via JavaScript or jQuery, right? So, you know, usually this is a client-side, you know, it's done via client-side, so that means you would use, you know, your JavaScript, basically. Okay, so be aware of that. You can use Ajax also, but this this website does not use any Ajax. Now, Apache and PHP, they have built-in methods to perform input validation. There used to be something called magic quotes. As we will see when we do the SQL lab, you'll see that basically one of the big things in SQL injections is one symbol, which is the single quote. There's a little single quote in there that can cause a lot of trouble, as we will see in the labs coming up. And a lot of these methods have built-in mechanisms, such as something called magic quotes, etc., to try to escape those characters. That's really the idea. But that, don't worry about that. We will cover that in the lab later on. It's something that, you know, some of these sometimes get deprecated. So by default, I would suggest that you check if you have that in there. Otherwise, there's just functions that are built in for input validation. So you're going to find a lot of functions in there. One important one that I would recommend is the MySQL Real Escape string. Now, one other thing that I would recommend is you can use something called PDO for the databases. It's an object for databases. So that's probably something you can use, okay, to make changes to your connections. But I'd also, at the same time, I don't recommend that you rewrite everything, okay? Get things to work, and only, you know, if you need to, modify the commands that are there, okay? The commands that are there. But we can certainly make changes if I think we need to. All right. So those, you know, so at this point, you know, I kind of gave you an introduction of the general topics of the project, and everything else will be addressed. So basically, going forward, everything else will be addressed through the labs. Okay, through the labs. But just be aware that there's a lot of ways that you can write the queries in databases. And so you could make changes to that if you'd like. In particular, if it's going to make your life easier, you could. Are there any questions at this time? No? Okay.
No.
All right. So we've talked about SQL. There's also PHP exploits. All right, so things in PHP that are not recommended. All right, so for instance, making system calls from PHP is actually technically not recommended. It's not something that you would probably want to do. But web security addresses the issues that are specific to how web servers present their content to web browsers, how the browsers interact with the servers, and how people interact with the browser. So that's the main goal. So PHP, as you know, is the middleware that handles requests from the user to the database, right? So PHP has it's called middleware. It has a central role between the user and the database. Okay. And these are called the PHP scripts. So I've talked about that. Now, one thing about PHP code that's really great is that it cannot be viewed on the browser. Even though if you don't remember this, you're going to have your PHP scripts in a folder somewhere, and you can view them, but anybody that finds that script will not be able to view the contents of the script. So that's why sometimes you put your your database connection there. People can't view it. However, it runs. Whenever it's like click, it'll run, but it's not going to show the contents of the PHP script. Instead, what it shows is what the result of running that query, where the result is the creation of an HTML file. So the output of PHP is always an HTML file, right? So the user, comes here, runs the script. Maybe the script interacts with the database, gets some data, but what it sends to the user here is only HTML. So that the script will generate as output an HTML file that then the user will open in their browser. So, it's not going to be, they won't be able to see it. So it's kind of a security mechanism in a sense, because you don't want people looking at your code, obviously. All right, and then there's going to be, just like with everything else, there's going to be code injections again. Code injections. And these are going to be, there are several types. SQL injections. There's going to be JavaScript injections. And there's going to be PHP injections. And so you can have, basically, a lot of the labs will relate to these. All right, so we will do labs for these because as with the buffer overflow labs and so on, all of those required specific knowledge about the syntax that we needed to use. How do we inject the code? But at this time, they're not going to be low-level injections like hex code or anything, because they're not really going into memory. Instead, they're going to be different injections that are trying to either manipulate, like are trying to run as JavaScript in the background, or they're trying to modify something in the database, or they're trying to run on the terminal via PHP, for instance. Right, so the simplest way that somebody could try to put in a code injection in PHP is simply to add the code. So this would be like an employee of the organization, right? That there's a PHP file, PHP, and it's got some scripts in here. The disgruntled employee adds some PHP code there, and then basically every time people run the code, their piece of code will also run, right? So that would be simplest injection, adding a PHP segment. We can call this adding a PHP segment. Okay, but that's, you know, pretty difficult to accomplish because it's a very, you know, it's somebody has to have access to everything to do it. So probably attackers will try to use other approaches. And there's issues with permissions and everything like that. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to all these topics. So I'm almost done for today. So next week, I will talk a little bit more about things related to the checkout process and the payment processor, the development process, and a little bit about databases and something called the mod rewrite engine. So that's something that is very central to this website as well, mod rewrite, and using the .htaccess file. So these are topics that I'm going to leave for next week. All right, so next week we will cover .htaccess, which, as you guys know, is pretty important file. And then this one has an engine called a mod rewrite. It's very powerful. So I need to talk about that. Otherwise, it's going to complicate things for you. And then we will come back to the checkout again, just a little bit. Sessions and cookies, remember that's something that I haven't talked about yet, but we will, you know, it's something that you will have to do to create accounts. We'll talk about PHP injections, yeah, and database security issues in general, like the principle of least privilege. So let's do that. Let's, I'll stop here as far as the lecture and then just leave another 10 minutes or so. If there's any questions on labs or anything. But so I'm gonna, as far as new content, I'm gonna stop here. So I'm gonna pause the video. All right, guys, we're gonna stop here for today, and I will see you on Tuesday. Don't forget to submit your homework assignment that's due tonight. All right, have a good weekend.